Stop wasting, Mom. So I played in secret and won 1.7 million. My name is Helen Whitmore. I'm 69 years old, and I've come to believe that sometimes the people you would give your life for will be the first to bury you alive and call it love. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. And if you, for even a second, feel like this sounds familiar, I just ask that you leave a like and subscribe, because this story might help someone draw closer to God's love. Amen. The morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of my small bedroom in Chicago, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor where I knelt every dawn for prayer. My arthritis-twisted fingers clutched the rosary beads my late husband Robert had given me 43 years ago, each bead smooth from decades of desperate petitions. The house around me buzzed with the familiar chaos of my son Eric's family rushing through their morning routine. But here in this corner, with my Bible open to Psalms, I found the only peace my heart knew. "Lord," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sound of cartoons playing in the living room. "Give me strength for another day. Help me serve them with love, even when—" The words caught in my throat. Even when what? Even when they treated me like hired help? Even when my own son looked at me with the same irritation he'd show a persistent salesperson at his door? The smell of coffee drifted under my door. Eric's expensive blend that I wasn't supposed to touch because it cost too much for someone like me to enjoy. I pressed my forehead against my clasped hands and tried to remember the woman I used to be. Helen Whitmore, who had raised her son alone after Robert's sudden heart attack. Helen, who had worked 3 jobs to keep Eric in Christian school, who had prayed over his homework and bandaged his scraped knees with the same gentle hands that now shook from years of hard labor and harder disappointments. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and my heart jumped with the foolish hope that fluttered in my chest every time I thought one of my grandchildren might actually want to talk to their grandmother. But the screen showed only a reminder about the doctor's appointment I'd scheduled 3 weeks ago, the one I'd already canceled twice because Eric said driving me was inconvenient, and the bus route would take too long for someone my age. I pulled myself up from my knees, each joint protesting the movement, and smoothed down the same faded blue dress I'd worn for the past 3 days. It was clean. I made sure of that. But it was also the only dress that didn't require ironing, and I'd learned not to ask for small favors that might inconvenience anyone. In the mirror above my dresser, I caught sight of the woman I'd become. Gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, eyes that had cried more tears than Lake Michigan could hold, and a face that bore the geography of every sleepless night I'd spent worrying about the people who no longer worried about me. The sound of Eric's voice carried through the thin walls, sharp with the kind of irritation he seemed to save specifically for discussions about me. "Sarah, did you see Mom left the porch light on again last night? Do you know what that costs? And she's been taking longer showers. I timed it yesterday. 8 minutes. We talked about this." My daughter-in-law's response came through clearly, tinged with the exasperation of someone discussing a troublesome pet. "Eric, your mother is getting old. Maybe we need to think about other arrangements. My friend Janet says there are nice assisted living places that aren't too expensive, and some of them even have church services." I sank onto the edge of my bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Other arrangements. The phrase echoed in my mind like a death sentence delivered in polite, reasonable tones. I thought about the small house in the countryside I'd sold 2 years ago. The house with the garden where I'd grown tomatoes and roses, where I'd been able to play my hymns without anyone rolling their eyes, where I'd been Helen Whitmore instead of Mom who costs too much. Eric had convinced me to sell it. "Mom, it'll be easier if you're nearby. You'll see the grandkids more. We can take better care of you." The lies had tasted so sweet when he'd spoken them, seasoned with just enough truth to make me believe that my only son actually wanted his mother close. But I hadn't been naive enough to expect luxury. I'd paid him rent every month from my Social Security, contributed to groceries, helped with utilities. I'd thought it was a partnership, a family arrangement built on mutual respect and love. Instead, I'd discovered I was just convenient labor. Free babysitting for 10-year-old Emma and 7-year-old Jake when Eric and Sarah wanted date nights. Free housekeeping when Sarah felt overwhelmed by her part-time job at the boutique. Free cooking when they got tired of takeout but didn't want to spend time in the kitchen themselves. And the rules. Sweet Jesus, the rules they'd created for my existence in their home. No Christian music during family time because it made Sarah uncomfortable. No grace before meals because it was old-fashioned and embarrassed them in front of friends. No religious decorations in common areas because their house wasn't a church. I'd learned to confine my faith to my small bedroom, practicing my devotions like some kind of shameful secret that needed to be hidden from the people I'd raised to know the Lord. The breakfast dishes clattered in the kitchen sink, and I knew my cue. Eric would leave for his job at the accounting firm in 20 minutes. Sarah would head to the boutique an hour later, and I'd be expected to have the house cleaned, laundry started, and lunch prepared for when the children came home from school. It was Wednesday, which meant I'd also need to prepare something special for dinner because Eric's boss might be calling tonight, and Sarah wanted to make sure the house smelled like someone who knew how to cook. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway, immediately assaulted by the sounds of a family that had learned to function around me rather than with me. Emma sat at the breakfast counter, her long brown hair falling across her face as she picked at a bowl of cereal that cost more than I'd spent on food for myself in a week. Jake sprawled on the living room floor, still in his pajamas, his attention completely absorbed by a tablet game that involved loud explosions and digital violence. "Morning, Grandma Helen," Emma mumbled without looking up from her phone, her greeting perfunctory and automatic. Jake didn't acknowledge my presence at all, his fingers dancing across the screen with the kind of focus I wished he'd show for his homework or his prayers. Sarah emerged from the master bedroom, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, wearing an outfit that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. She glanced at me with the brief, assessing look of someone checking to make sure their employee had arrived on time. "Helen, I need you to pick up my dry cleaning today," she said, not requesting but informing. "The ticket is on the kitchen counter. And can you make sure Jake actually brushes his teeth before school? He's been pretending, and his teacher mentioned it yesterday." I nodded, swallowing the words that wanted to escape. Words about how Jake might listen better to his mother's instructions than his grandmother's requests. Words about how picking up dry cleaning meant taking the bus across town with my arthritic hands carrying garments that cost more than I'd ever owned. Words about how I'd raised my own son to brush his teeth without supervision. But apparently my parenting lessons hadn't transferred to the next generation. Eric appeared in the kitchen, adjusting his tie with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd mastered the art of looking successful. At 44, he'd inherited his father's broad shoulders and dark hair, but none of Robert's gentle spirit or generous heart. Success had hardened him, turned him into someone who measured everything by its cost, and everyone by their contribution to his carefully constructed life. "Mom," he said, his tone carrying the weight of an important announcement, "we need to talk tonight about your spending. Sarah showed me the receipt from the thrift store last week. $20 for a sweater? We've talked about this. You can't just spend money without thinking about how it affects the household budget." The sweater hung in my closet, soft blue wool that had reminded me of the dress I'd worn to Robert's funeral. I'd found it on the clearance rack, marked down from $40, and I'd debated for 20 minutes before allowing myself this single small luxury. It was the first piece of clothing I'd bought for myself in 8 months, purchased with money I'd saved by skipping lunch for 2 weeks. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the apology automatic and hollow. I thought, since it was my own money. "Your money?" Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Helen, you live here rent-free, eat our food, use our utilities. There is no your money anymore. Everything affects all of us." The lie hit me like a physical blow. Rent-free. I'd been paying them $600 a month from my Social Security, money they'd requested to cover my portion of household expenses. I'd been buying my own groceries with food stamps and the remainder of my check, eating smaller portions so there would be enough, skipping meals when money ran short before the next payment arrived. But I said nothing, because when you're 69 years old and your bones ache more than your heart can bear, when you've outlived your husband and your usefulness, when your own son speaks to you like you're a burden he's generously carrying, you learn that silence is sometimes the only dignity left to preserve. Eric grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, calling over his shoulder. "And Mom, try to keep the kids quieter this afternoon. I might have an important call." The door slammed behind him, and I stood in the kitchen surrounded by the debris of their morning routine. Coffee cups with lipstick stains, cereal bowls with milk growing warm, scattered papers from Emma's backpack, Jake's forgotten lunchbox sitting on the counter. This was my inheritance. Other people's messes and my own broken heart. I began clearing the dishes, my hands moving through the familiar motions, while my mind wandered to the small pile of lottery tickets hidden in my Bible. $1 tickets I bought with change from bottle returns and the occasional quarter I found in the laundry. It wasn't gambling, I told myself. It was hope. Hope that maybe, someday, something good might happen to the woman who had spent her entire life making good things happen for everyone else. But as I scraped the remains of my family's breakfast into the garbage disposal, I wondered if God had forgotten about Helen Whitmore. If perhaps my prayers had gotten lost somewhere between my bedroom and heaven, buried under the weight of my own invisible existence. The memories came flooding back as I stood at that kitchen sink, my hands submerged in soapy water that had grown cold. 43 years ago, when Robert's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning while he was fixing our neighbor's fence, always helping someone, just like the man I'd married. I remembered holding 3-year-old Eric in my arms at the funeral, promising both my son and my dying husband that I'd raise this boy to be a man of God, a man of character. How many nights had I knelt beside Eric's twin bed, my knees pressed into the cold hardwood floor of our tiny apartment, praying through tears that the Lord would provide? "Father, make him strong," I'd whispered. "Make him kind. Let him know your love so he can share it with others." My hands would smooth his dark hair as he slept, and I'd promise both Eric and Jesus that I'd do whatever it took to raise him right. I'd kept that promise in ways that had cost me everything. The job at Morrison's Laundry, working the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., then catching the bus home to get Eric ready for school. My back still ached from those years of lifting industrial washing machines and pressing shirts for other people's families, while my own son ate cereal for dinner. But Eric had his Christian school education. Eric had his basketball shoes and his field trip money, and his Christmas presents wrapped with love, even when I'd wrapped them with fingers swollen from double shifts. The day Eric graduated high school, valedictorian, full scholarship to Northwestern University, I'd sat in that auditorium and wept with joy. "Thank you, Jesus," I'd prayed. "Thank you for making something beautiful out of my sacrifice." I'd believed then that every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every prayer whispered through exhaustion had been worth it. My son would be different. My son would remember what his mother had given him and carry that gratitude forward into his own family. But success had a way of rewriting history. As Eric's accounting career flourished, as he bought his first house and then his second, larger one, as he married Sarah with her sorority smile and her taste for expensive things, the story of his childhood began to change. The sacrifices I'd made became things he'd overcome. The love I'd poured into him became outdated parenting methods that he and Sarah would certainly improve upon with their own children. I dried my hands on the dish towel and walked to the living room window, looking out at the Chicago street where I'd once felt so grateful to live. When Eric first suggested I sell my country house, I'd resisted. My small home had been paid off, left to me by Robert's life insurance and my own careful savings over the decades. It had a garden where I grew vegetables and flowers, a front porch where I'd sit with my Bible in the evenings, neighbors who'd known me for 20 years and still invited me to church potlucks and holiday gatherings. But Eric had painted such a beautiful picture. "Mom, you're getting older. What if something happens and you're all alone out there? Here in the city, we're just 10 minutes away. Emma and Jake will see their grandmother every day. You'll be part of our family in a real way. Part of the family." The words had sung in my heart like a hymn of hope. After decades of loneliness, of holidays spent watching other families through restaurant windows, of Sundays when the only conversation I had was with the grocery store cashier, the possibility of belonging somewhere again had seemed like answered prayer. I'd sold my house for $127,000 and given Eric $85,000 of it for household expenses and improvements to accommodate me. The remaining money had gone into a modest savings account that Eric managed because he was better with finances. In 2 years, that account had dwindled to less than $3,000. depleted by emergency family expenses that somehow always coincided with Eric's desire for new furniture or Sarah's need for a shopping weekend. The irony burned in my chest like acid reflux. I'd given them my independence, my security, my home, and in return, I'd received a bedroom barely larger than my old closet and the privilege of earning my keep through unpaid domestic service. When I'd timidly suggested that perhaps I could contribute in other ways, maybe volunteer at a local church or senior center, Sarah had looked at me with genuine confusion. But Helen, we need you here. Who would watch the kids after school? Who would keep the house clean? We both work, you know. This arrangement benefits everyone. Everyone except me. But I'd learned that my feelings weren't part of the family equation. The sound of Jake's video game filled the silence, punctuated by Emma's fingers tapping on her phone screen. These were my grandchildren. The little ones I'd dreamed of spoiling with homemade cookies and Bible stories. The children who would carry forward the faith I'd tried so hard to instill in their father. Instead, they barely knew me as anything more than the old woman who cooked their meals and cleaned their rooms. I'd tried, in the beginning, to connect with them. I'd offered to read them stories from my beautiful illustrated Bible, the one Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary. Emma had rolled her eyes and said, "Grandma, those stories are made up. Mom says they're just metaphors." Jake had been more direct. "That stuff is boring. Can you turn on Netflix instead?" When I'd approached Eric about taking the children to church with me on Sundays, he'd been gentle but firm. "Mom, we've decided to let them choose their own path when they're older. We don't want to force religion on them the way some families do. As if the faith that had sustained me through widowhood and poverty and decades of hard work was some kind of child abuse to be avoided. I walked to my bedroom and closed the door, then knelt beside my bed and pulled out the small wooden box I kept hidden beneath folded sweaters. Inside were the mementos of a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. Photos of Robert and me on our wedding day, both of us radiating joy and hope for the future we'd build together. Pictures of Eric as a baby, as a toddler, as a young man walking across the graduation stage, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, the small collection of lottery tickets I'd been buying for the past 6 months. $1 scratch-offs purchased with quarters I'd saved from laundry change and nickels I'd found in coat pockets. It wasn't much, maybe 5 or 6 tickets total, but it was the only thing in my life that belonged entirely to me, my secret hope, my tiny rebellion against a world that had decided Helen Whitmore didn't deserve dreams anymore. I'd started buying them after a particularly difficult day, when Sarah had announced in front of the children that I was costing them too much, and maybe it was time to explore other options. I'd sat on my bed that night, crying silent tears into my pillow, when I remembered passing a gas station on my way home from the grocery store. Something about the bright colors of the lottery display had caught my attention, and for the first time in months, I'd allowed myself to imagine, what if? What if something good could still happen to me? The first ticket had been a loser, but scratching off those silver squares had felt like unwrapping a present. The second had won me $2, which I'd immediately used to buy another ticket. It became my Sunday afternoon ritual. After church, before dinner preparation, I'd sit on my bed and scratch one ticket, allowing myself 5 minutes to dream about what I might do with unexpected money. Travel to the Holy Land, visit the places where Jesus walked, donate to the missionaries I'd been supporting for 20 years but could no longer afford to help, maybe even buy back my little house in the country, if it was still available. These were foolish dreams for a foolish old woman, but they were mine. And in a life where everything else belonged to someone else, foolish dreams felt like treasures. As I knelt there beside my bed, holding those tickets in my arthritis-twisted fingers, I closed my eyes and whispered the prayer that had become my daily petition. Lord, I don't understand your plan for me. I don't know why serving you has led me to a place where I feel so forgotten and unwanted, but I trust you. Even when I can't see your hand at work, I trust you. If this is a test, give me strength to endure it with grace. If this is preparation for something better, help me wait with patience. And if this is simply my cross to bear, help me carry it without becoming bitter. Outside my door, I heard Sarah's voice calling instructions about dinner preparations, and I knew my 5 minutes of solitude were over. I carefully wrapped the lottery tickets back in their tissue paper and returned them to their hiding place beneath my sweaters. Tomorrow was Thursday, which meant Eric would want his favorite pot roast, and Sarah would want the house spotless because her book club was meeting here in the evening. But tonight, as I'd done every night for 6 months, I'd add one more line to my prayers. And Lord, if you're still listening to old Helen Whitmore, if you still care about the dreams of foolish women who probably ask for too much, maybe let something good happen, not because I deserve it, but because I need to believe you haven't forgotten me completely. I opened my bedroom door and stepped back into the hallway, ready to become invisible again. But deep in my heart, in a place where hope refused to die despite all evidence to the contrary, I held on to the impossible possibility that God might still have plans for Helen Whitmore. Plans that didn't involve shrinking smaller and smaller until I disappeared entirely. Am I being tested or just forgotten? The question followed me to the kitchen like a shadow, but I pushed it aside and began planning dinner for people who had stopped seeing me as anything more than a convenience. Because what else was an old woman supposed to do? Where else was she supposed to go? And how do you rebuild a life when everyone who should love you has decided you're not worth the investment? 3 weeks later, my 69th birthday arrived on a Tuesday morning with all the fanfare of yesterday's newspaper. I woke before dawn, as I always did, and knelt for my morning prayers with the desperate hope that maybe today someone would remember. Maybe Eric would surprise me with a card. Maybe Emma would draw me a picture. Maybe Jake would give me one of his rare hugs that made my heart feel whole again. But breakfast came and went with nothing more than Sarah asking me to remember to vacuum the upstairs hallway before her mother visited that afternoon. She's very particular about cleanliness, Sarah explained, as if I hadn't been keeping house longer than she'd been alive. Eric rushed out the door with his briefcase and coffee, calling over his shoulder about some important client meeting that would keep him late. The children left for school without a word, their backpacks heavy with homework I'd helped them complete the night before while their parents watched television in the master bedroom. And just like that, my birthday became another invisible day in an invisible life. I spent the morning cleaning a house that was already spotless, dusting furniture that bore no fingerprints except my own, organizing closets that belonged to people who had forgotten I existed. At lunch, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a peanut butter sandwich and a glass of water, staring at the calendar on the refrigerator where everyone else's appointments and activities were marked in different colored pens. Soccer practice for Jake, book club for Sarah, business dinner for Eric. My name appeared nowhere, as if I'd been erased from the family timeline. That afternoon, while Sarah entertained her mother in the living room, I overheard their conversation through the thin walls. Helen seems to be doing well, Sarah's mother observed, though she looks a bit thinner than when I saw her last Christmas. Oh, she's fine, Sarah replied with the casual dismissal she'd perfected. We keep her plenty busy. She loves feeling useful again. At her age, having purpose is so important. Purpose. As if washing their dishes and folding their laundry was the grand destiny God had planned for Helen Whitmore. As if the woman who had raised a successful son, who had worked 3 jobs to keep him in Christian school, who had volunteered at church and cared for sick neighbors for decades, had finally found her true calling as unpaid household staff. She's very quiet, though, Sarah's mother continued. I barely hear her moving around. Is she happy here? Honestly, I think she's grateful. She was so lonely in that old house all by herself. Here, she's surrounded by family. She has her grandchildren to dote on. Really, we're doing her a favor. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from crying out loud. Grateful. They thought I was grateful for the privilege of being ignored, dismissed, and treated like furniture that occasionally needed maintenance. They thought loneliness was cured by proximity to people who couldn't be bothered to speak to you except to issue instructions. That evening, when Eric finally came home from his important meeting, I gathered the courage to mention my birthday. I waited until dinner was finished and the dishes were cleared, until the children had disappeared to their rooms and Sarah was busy with her evening skincare routine. Eric, I said softly, my heart hammering as he scrolled through his phone at the kitchen table. Did you remember what today was? He looked up with the blank expression of someone trying to recall a forgotten appointment. Tuesday? It's my birthday, I whispered, feeling like a child begging for attention. His face went through a series of emotions: surprise, embarrassment, then defensive irritation. "Mom, why didn't you remind me? You know how crazy things have been at work. Sarah's been stressed with her book club hosting, and the kids have so much going on. We can't be expected to remember everything. Can't be expected to remember their mother's birthday." The words hit me like a slap, but Eric wasn't finished. "Look, we'll do something this weekend, okay? Maybe Sarah can pick up a cake or something. But you've got to understand, we're not mind readers. If you want something, you need to speak up. Speak up." As if I hadn't been speaking into the void for 2 years. As if my words carried any weight in a house where my existence was tolerated rather than celebrated. As if asking for basic human acknowledgement was an unreasonable burden on people who took my labor for granted every single day. I nodded and smiled, because that's what good Christian women do. We forgive. We turn the other cheek. We suffer in silence because Jesus suffered for us. But as I lay in my narrow bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of my family's evening routine through the walls, I felt something crack inside my chest that had nothing to do with my aging heart. The weekend cake never materialized. Sarah mentioned being too busy, and Eric said they'd definitely do something special next year. Next year felt like a promise made to someone they expected to be gone by then. It was the following Sunday morning when everything finally shattered. I'd been looking forward to church all week. The one place where I still felt like Helen Whitmore instead of Mom who costs too much. St. Mary's Catholic Church had been my spiritual home for 15 years. A beautiful old building with stained glass windows that painted rainbows across the wooden pews when the morning sun hit them just right. Father Martinez knew my name, asked about my health, remembered that I'd been a faithful volunteer before my circumstances changed. But as I prepared to leave for the 9 a.m. service, Eric appeared in the kitchen with his coffee and newspaper, wearing the expression he reserved for delivering bad news. "Mom, we need you to stay home this morning. Sarah's having some of her girlfriends over for brunch, and we need someone to keep an eye on the kids. Make sure they don't interrupt the adults." I stood frozen by the back door, my purse clutched in my arthritic fingers, my best dress carefully chosen for this one weekly occasion when I felt like I mattered to someone. "But Eric, it's Sunday. I haven't missed Mass in 2 years. "It's one Sunday, Mom. God will understand. Besides, watching your grandchildren is just as important as sitting in some building, right? Jesus said, 'Suffer the little children to come unto me.'" The casual way he twisted scripture to justify keeping me from worship felt like blasphemy. But worse than that was the realization that this wasn't really about babysitting. This was about keeping the old woman out of sight when Sarah wanted to impress her friends. This was about making sure I didn't embarrass them by existing too visibly in their carefully curated life. "Please," I whispered, hating how desperate I sounded. "I could take them with me. Emma and Jake could." "Absolutely not." Sarah appeared in the doorway, already dressed in an outfit that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. "I'm not having my children subjected to that environment, all that guilt and judgment. It's not healthy for developing minds." That environment. She was talking about the house of God like it was a crack den. Talking about the faith that had sustained me through widowhood and poverty, and every trial life had thrown at me like it was some kind of disease I might spread to her children. I felt my knees go weak, and I grabbed the doorframe for support. I need to go to church. It's the only thing, please." "Mom, you're being dramatic," Eric said, not even looking up from his newspaper. "It's a building. You can pray here just as well as you can pray there. In fact, serving your family is probably more Christ-like than sitting in a pew for an hour." The words hit me like physical blows. Dramatic. As if my spiritual needs were theatrical performances designed to inconvenience them. As if the faith that had shaped my entire life was some kind of hobby I could practice anywhere, like knitting or reading magazines. I stood there for a long moment, looking at my son, the boy I'd raised to know the Lord, the man I'd sacrificed everything to educate and nurture, and realized I was looking at a stranger. Somewhere between the child who'd knelt beside his bed to say prayers and the adult who dismissed those prayers as outdated superstition, I'd lost him completely. "Okay," I whispered, setting my purse down on the kitchen counter. "I'll stay." I spent that Sunday morning in my bedroom, listening to the sounds of Sarah's brunch party through the walls while Emma and Jake played video games in the living room. The laughter and conversation that drifted up from downstairs felt like it was happening in another world, one where I'd never been invited and never would be. I knelt beside my bed and tried to pray, but for the first time in my life, the words wouldn't come. I opened my Bible to the Psalms that had always comforted me, but the verses seemed written in a foreign language. I held my rosary beads, but my fingers couldn't remember the familiar rhythm of Hail Marys that had sustained me through every crisis. "Are you there?" I whispered to the ceiling, my voice cracking with desperation. "Are you listening to me at all? Because I've been faithful to you for 69 years, and I feel more alone than I've ever felt in my life." The silence that answered me was deafening. That afternoon, after Sarah's friends had gone home and the house had returned to its usual rhythm of casual neglect, I discovered something that broke the last fragile piece of my heart. While cleaning the living room, I found a card that had fallen behind the couch cushions, a birthday card addressed to me from my dear friend Margaret at St. Mary's. The envelope had been opened, the card read, and then apparently discarded like junk mail. "Happy birthday to a beautiful soul," Margaret had written in her careful script. "The church auxiliary missed you at our last meeting. We're praying for you always. Love and blessings." Someone at church had remembered my birthday. Someone had cared enough to send a card, to let me know I was missed and prayed for. And my own family had opened it, read it, and thrown it away without a word. I sat on the living room floor, holding that crumpled card, and wept. Not the silent tears I'd grown accustomed to, but deep, body-shaking sobs that came from a place I'd kept locked away for 2 years. The sound of my own crying frightened me. It was the sound of something breaking that could never be repaired. "Grandma Helen?" Emma's voice came from the doorway, uncertain and slightly scared. "Are you okay?" I looked up at her through my tears. This beautiful 10-year-old girl who barely knew her grandmother existed most days. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just miss some people." "Like Grandpa Robert?" The innocence in her question undid me completely. "Yes, baby, like Grandpa Robert." But that wasn't the whole truth. I missed the woman I used to be. I missed feeling valuable and loved and needed for who I was rather than what I could do. I missed believing that God had a plan for Helen Whitmore that included dignity and purpose and the simple human pleasure of being seen by the people she loved. That night, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable even a week earlier. I walked to the kitchen, opened the junk drawer where Sarah kept miscellaneous items, and took out $5 from the emergency cash she kept there for pizza delivery. It wasn't stealing, I told myself. I'd been contributing my Social Security to this household for 2 years. $5 was a fraction of what I'd given them. The next morning, while Eric was at work and Sarah was at the boutique and the children were at school, I walked to the gas station 3 blocks away and bought 5 lottery tickets. Not because I believed I would win anything meaningful, but because I needed to do something, anything, that belonged entirely to me, something that represented hope, however foolish, that my story wasn't over yet. I scratched them off sitting on a bench outside the store, my hands shaking not from arthritis, but from the transgression of doing something purely for myself. 4 of them were losers, but the 5th one, a simple scratch-off with pictures of treasure chests, revealed 3 matching symbols. $50. I stared at the ticket for a long time, hardly believing what I was seeing. $50. Enough to buy groceries for a week, enough to get my hair done properly for the first time in 2 years, enough to buy a birthday cake for myself if I wanted one. But as I sat on that bench in the warm Chicago sunshine, holding that winning ticket in my trembling fingers, I realized something that changed everything. I didn't want to spend this money on practical things. I didn't want to buy groceries or get my hair done or celebrate my forgotten birthday. I wanted to buy more tickets. Because for the first time in 2 years, I had evidence that good things could still happen to Helen Whitmore. Small good things, maybe, but good nonetheless. And if God was still listening to the prayers of foolish old women, if he still cared about the dreams of people everyone else had written off, then maybe this $50 was just the beginning. Maybe he hadn't forgotten me after all. The $50 felt like a burning secret in my pocket for 3 days. I'd hidden the money in my Bible, tucked between the pages of Psalms where I'd underlined verses about God's provision for the widow and the forgotten. Every morning during my prayers, I'd feel the crisp bills against my fingertips and wonder if this was God's way of telling me something, or if I was just a foolish old woman grasping at false hope. On Thursday evening, while I was preparing Eric's favorite pot roast dinner, Sarah made an announcement that sent ice through my veins. "Helen, we need to talk about your spending habits." She stood in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, wearing the expression she reserved for disciplining the children. "I checked the emergency cash this morning, and $5 is missing." My hands froze over the carrots I was peeling. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around me like a trap. Eric appeared behind Sarah, still wearing his work clothes, his face already set in disappointment before he'd even heard the full story. "Mom," he said with the tone he'd use for a child caught stealing candy, "we've talked about this. You can't just take money without asking. That's not how families work." Families. The word felt like a knife twisting in my chest. In what family did a 69-year-old woman who contributed her entire Social Security check have to ask permission to take $5 from an emergency fund? In what family was trust so completely absent that everyone was suspected of theft? I needed it for something," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the sizzling of the pot roast in the oven. "For what?" Sarah demanded, stepping closer. "What could you possibly need that you couldn't ask us for? We provide everything you need: food, shelter, clothing. What else could there be? Everything I need. As if human beings only required physical necessities. As if dignity, respect, and the occasional small pleasure were luxuries that old women had forfeited the right to desire." "Answer her, Mom," Eric said, his voice hardening. "Where did the money go?" I could have lied. I could have said I'd bought medicine or toiletries or any number of practical items they might have approved of. But something in their accusatory stares, something in the way they'd cornered me in my own kitchen like a criminal, made me tell the truth. I bought lottery tickets. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's mouth fell open in what looked like genuine shock, while Eric's face cycled through disbelief, embarrassment, and finally, anger. "Lottery tickets?" Sarah repeated, as if I'd confessed to buying illegal drugs. "Helen, that's gambling. That's pathetic." "It's not pathetic," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "It's hope." "Hope?" Eric laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Mom, you're 69 years old. You're living in our house, eating our food, depending on us for everything. And you're wasting money on lottery tickets? That's not hope. That's delusion. It's my money," I said, the words coming out stronger than I'd intended. "I contribute to this household. I work here every day. That $5 came from money I've given you." "Your money?" Sarah stepped closer, her voice rising to the pitch she used when the children misbehaved. "Helen, you live here out of charity. Everything you have, everything you eat, everything you use comes from our generosity. There is no your money anymore. Charity." The word hit me like a physical blow. 2 years of believing I was part of a family, and I was actually a charity case. 2 years of thinking my contributions mattered, and I was actually living on their generosity. "I pay rent," I said quietly, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. $600 a month from my Social Security. I buy groceries. I pay for utilities. "You pay a portion," Eric corrected, his tone growing colder. "A small portion. Do you have any idea what it actually costs to maintain this household? What it costs to support an elderly person with health issues and special needs? Special needs. As if being old was some kind of disability they'd heroically agreed to accommodate. As if my arthritis and my need for regular medication made me a burden they were generously shouldering." "But that's not even the point," Sarah interrupted, her voice taking on the self-righteous tone she used when explaining why the children couldn't have certain toys or foods. "The point is that gambling is wrong, Helen. It's irresponsible. It's unchristian. How can you sit in your room reading your Bible and then go out and gamble? Unchristian." She was lecturing me about Christianity. Sarah, who forbade grace at meals and rolled her eyes when I hummed hymns, who'd banned religious decorations from the house and kept my grandchildren away from church. She was telling me that my faith was somehow compromised by $5 worth of hope. Would Jesus forgive this too? I whispered, more to myself than to them. Should I forgive again? What did you say? Eric demanded. I looked up at my son, this man I'd raised to know right from wrong, to show compassion for those who struggled, to honor his mother as the commandments required. I saw a stranger wearing his face, a successful businessman who'd forgotten where he came from and who'd paid the price for his success. I said, should I forgive again? Should I keep turning the other cheek while you both treat me like a servant who should be grateful for scraps from your table? Mom, you're being dramatic again, Eric said. But something in his voice suggested I'd hit a nerve. We're trying to help you. We're trying to keep you from making mistakes that could hurt you financially. Hurt me financially? I stood up straighter, feeling something shifting inside my chest. Not breaking this time, but solidifying. Eric, I sold my house and gave you $85,000. I've been paying you $600 a month in rent for 2 years. I buy groceries. I clean your house. I watch your children. I cook your meals. How exactly am I hurting anyone financially? Sarah's face flushed red. That money went toward home improvements and investments that benefit everyone. It's not like we spent it on ourselves. The new car you bought last month? That's different. That's a necessity. The vacation to Cabo you took at Christmas? We needed that time away. Taking care of you is stressful. Taking care of me. As if I was an invalid rather than a capable woman who'd been managing her own life for 69 years before they'd convinced her to give up her independence. I work every day in this house, I said, my voice growing stronger. I contribute more than I cost. And if I want to spend $5 of my own money on lottery tickets, that's my choice. Not while you're living under our roof, Eric said with finality. Not while you're dependent on us for everything. If you want to make your own choices, you need to be able to support those choices yourself. The ultimatum hung in the air between us like a sword. Support myself. At 69, with arthritis and high blood pressure and a social security check that wouldn't cover rent anywhere in Chicago. Support myself when they'd convinced me to give up my paid-off house and my savings and my independence. So, what are you saying? I asked quietly. I'm saying that if you can't follow reasonable rules and show respect for this family, maybe we need to consider other arrangements, Eric replied, not meeting my eyes. Other arrangements. The same phrase Sarah had used months ago, the threat that had been hanging over my head like a storm cloud. Assisted living facilities where old people went to die slowly among strangers. Nursing homes where the hallways smelled of disinfectant and despair. Just then, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her young face troubled by the raised voices she'd been hearing. She looked between her parents and me with the confused expression of a child trying to understand adult cruelty. "Why are you yelling at Grandma Helen?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. "We're not yelling, sweetheart," Sarah said, instantly transforming her voice into the gentle tone she used with her children. "We're just having a discussion about household rules." Emma looked at me with eyes that seemed older than her 10 years. "Grandma, are you in trouble?" Before I could answer, Eric knelt down to Emma's level with the patient smile he saved for his children. "Grandma made some poor choices, honey. Sometimes adults have to have difficult conversations about consequences." Poor choices. In front of my granddaughter, I was being branded as someone who made poor choices, someone who needed to be corrected and controlled. Emma's confused expression told me she didn't understand what was happening, but she was learning that Grandma Helen was someone who disappointed people, someone who caused problems. "Can I talk to Grandma alone?" Emma asked with the unexpected boldness that sometimes emerged from quiet children. Sarah started to object, but Eric nodded. 5 minutes. Then homework time. After her parents left the kitchen, Emma climbed onto one of the breakfast counter stools and looked at me with the serious expression she wore when she was trying to figure out something complicated. "Grandma, why do Mom and Dad always seem mad at you?" The question broke my heart because it came from such genuine confusion. This innocent child had noticed what the adults pretended didn't exist, the constant undercurrent of irritation and resentment that colored every interaction I had with her parents. "Sometimes, sweetheart, grown-ups don't understand each other very well," I said carefully, not wanting to burden her with problems she was too young to comprehend. "But you're nice to everyone," Emma continued. You make good food and you help with my homework and you never yell. I don't understand why they're always upset with you. Out of the mouths of babes. This 10-year-old child could see what her parents had chosen to ignore, that I treated everyone with kindness and respect, that I contributed positively to their household, that their treatment of me was unfair and unkind. Emma, I said, kneeling down so we were at eye level, do you know that your grandma loves you very much? She nodded solemnly. And do you know that sometimes people have to make difficult decisions about their lives? Another nod, though I could see she didn't fully understand what I was implying. I want you to remember that whatever happens, your Grandma Helen thinks you're a beautiful, smart, wonderful girl. And I want you to be kind to people, especially people who are older or who need help. Can you promise me that? Are you going away, Grandma? The question pierced my heart like an arrow. I don't know, sweetheart. But if I do, it won't be because I don't love you. That night, after Emma had gone to bed and Eric and Sarah had retreated to their master bedroom, I sat on my narrow bed with my Bible open and my lottery ticket hidden in the pages of Matthew. $50. Not enough to change my life, but enough to prove that sometimes even forgotten old women could experience small miracles. I thought about Emma's question, why do Mom and Dad always seem mad at you? And I realized that she'd identified the core of my existence in this house. I lived under a constant cloud of disapproval, constantly bracing for the next criticism, the next rule, the next reminder that I was a burden being grudgingly tolerated. That wasn't a life. That was just existence, and barely that. I opened my Bible to Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. All things. Even lottery tickets bought with desperate hope by lonely old women. Even conflicts in kitchens where charity was weaponized and dignity was treated like a luxury. Even granddaughters who saw injustice more clearly than the adults around them. For the first time in months, I felt something stirring in my chest that wasn't grief or resignation. It felt like possibility. It felt like the beginning of a plan. Tomorrow, I decided I would take my $50 and buy more tickets. Not because I was addicted to gambling, but because I was addicted to hope. And if God was truly working all things for good, then maybe He was preparing something for Helen Whitmore that no one, not even Helen Whitmore, could imagine yet. The next morning, while Eric rushed through his breakfast and Sarah applied her makeup in the hallway mirror, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. I walked to the kitchen counter where Eric's briefcase sat open, pulled out my monthly rent envelope, $600 in cash that I'd withdrawn from my Social Security the day before, and slipped it back into my purse. For the first time in 2 years, I was not going to pay rent to live in a house where I was treated like an unwelcome burden. My hands trembled as I zipped my purse closed, but it wasn't fear making them shake. It was something else entirely, a feeling I'd almost forgotten existed. It felt like power, like choice, like the possibility that Helen Whitmore still had some say in her own life. Mom, don't forget to pick up my dry cleaning today, Sarah called from the hallway, her voice carrying the casual authority of someone who'd never doubted that her wishes would be obeyed. And can you make sure Jake actually eats his lunch this time? The school called yesterday about him throwing away his sandwiches. I listened to her instructions with new ears, hearing not reasonable requests from a busy daughter-in-law, but commands from someone who saw me as hired help, someone who expected my obedience without offering respect in return. Sarah, I said, surprising both of us with the steadiness in my voice, I won't be picking up your dry cleaning today. She stopped applying her lipstick and turned to look at me, her expression shifting from confusion to irritation. What do you mean you won't be picking it up? You always pick it up on Fridays. I always have, I agreed. But today I'm going to do something different. Eric looked up from his phone, clearly annoyed by this unexpected disruption to their established routine. Mom, what's this about? Are you feeling sick? No, I said, standing a little straighter. I'm feeling like I need to make some changes in my life. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions and rising tension. Sarah exchanged a glance with Eric that spoke volumes about their shared frustration with my newfound unpredictability. Changes? Eric repeated, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. Mom, you're almost 70 years old. What kind of changes could you possibly need to make? Almost 70. As if my age disqualified me from having wants, needs, or dreams. As if turning 69 had somehow stripped me of the right to determine my own daily activities. I'm going to spend the day doing something for myself, I said, each word feeling like a small act of rebellion. Something that makes me happy. Sarah's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Helen, this is real life, not some fantasy where you get to do whatever you want whenever you want. We all have responsibilities. We all have to do things we don't particularly enjoy. You're right, I agreed. We do all have responsibilities. And my responsibility today is to myself. Before either of them could respond, I walked to my bedroom and closed the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. But underneath the nervousness was something else. A warm, spreading sensation that felt almost like joy. I knelt beside my bed and pulled out my hidden lottery tickets, including the $50 winner I'd been carrying like a talisman. Today, I was going to cash it in. Today, I was going to take that money and buy more tickets. Not because I expected to win anything significant, but because it was my choice to make. Lord, I whispered, my fingers wrapped around my rosary beads. I don't know if what I'm doing is right or wrong. I don't know if this is wisdom or foolishness, but I'm placing my trust in you. I'm believing that you haven't forgotten about Helen Whitmore, and that maybe, just maybe, you have plans for me that I can't see yet. I dressed carefully in my best outfit, a navy blue dress I'd owned for 10 years but saved for special occasions. I styled my gray hair as nicely as I could with the limited supplies in my small bathroom. I even applied the lipstick I'd been saving for someday, realizing that someday might never come if I kept waiting for permission to live my own life. When I emerged from my bedroom, Eric and Sarah had already left for work, but they'd left a list of chores on the kitchen counter. A detailed inventory of everything they expected me to accomplish while they were gone. Vacuum the living room, clean the bathrooms, start a load of laundry, prepare dinner ingredients, call the repair service about the leaky faucet. I looked at that list for a long moment, then folded it carefully and put it in the trash can. Instead, I walked to the bus stop and rode across town to the convenience store where I'd bought my first lottery tickets. The clerk remembered me. A kind young man named Marcus who always smiled when he saw me coming. Mrs. Helen, he greeted me with genuine warmth. How are you today? You look very nice. Thank you, Marcus, I said, feeling my cheeks warm with pleasure. When was the last time someone had complimented my appearance? When was the last time someone had seemed genuinely happy to see me? I cashed in my $50 winner and stood in front of the lottery display, studying the different options with the careful attention I'd once reserved for grocery shopping with limited funds. This time, instead of buying one modest ticket, I purchased 10 different scratch-offs, spreading my newfound wealth across multiple possibilities. Feeling lucky today? Marcus asked with a friendly grin. I'm feeling hopeful, I replied. And sometimes that's the same thing. I found a quiet bench in a small park nearby and settled down to scratch my tickets with the methodical patience of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do. The first 3 were losers, but I didn't feel disappointed. The act of scratching them off, of revealing the hidden symbols underneath the silver coating, felt like unwrapping presents from a generous God. The 4th ticket revealed 2 matching symbols and a third that was tantalizingly close but not quite right. The 5th was another loser. But the 6th, I had to look at it 3 times before I trusted what I was seeing. 3 golden bells in a row. The winning amount printed clearly at the bottom. $500. $500. I stared at that ticket until the numbers began to blur through the tears forming in my eyes. $500 was more money than I'd had control over in 2 years. It was freedom to make choices without asking permission. It was proof that sometimes, when you take a leap of faith, the ground doesn't disappear beneath your feet. But more than the money, it was validation. It was God's way of telling me that Helen Whitmore still mattered, that her dreams and hopes weren't foolish delusions, but legitimate prayers worthy of answered. I finished scratching the remaining tickets with trembling fingers. 2 more small winners, $20 and $15, brought my total winnings to $535. More money than my monthly rent payment. more money than I'd spent on myself in years. As I sat on that park bench, holding those winning tickets in my arthritic hands, I felt something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was called. Peace. Not the desperate peace of resignation, but the deep peace of knowing you're exactly where God wants you to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. I didn't rush to cash in the tickets immediately. Instead, I spent the afternoon walking through parts of Chicago I'd never explored, eating lunch at a small diner where the waitress called me honey, and didn't seem to mind that I took my time deciding what to order. I visited a bookstore and spent an hour browsing books I couldn't afford to buy, running my fingers along the spines and reading back covers like love letters to a future where I might have leisure time and disposable income again. When I finally returned to Eric's house that evening, I found chaos waiting for me. Sarah's car was in the driveway hours earlier than usual, and through the front windows I could see her pacing in the living room with her cell phone pressed to her ear. "She's not answering," I heard her say as I approached the front door. "I've called 6 times. This isn't like her. What if something happened?" I paused with my key in the lock, suddenly understanding that my absence had caused them worry, not because they cared about my well-being, but because my disappearance had disrupted their carefully orchestrated system of domestic support. When I opened the door, Sarah spun around with an expression of relief that quickly transformed into anger. "Helen, where have you been? I've been calling you for hours." "I don't have a cell phone," I reminded her gently. "You know that." "Well, where were you? The dry cleaning place said you never showed up." "The house is exactly the way we left it this morning. Nothing on your list got done." "I went out," I said simply. "I spent the day doing things for myself." Eric appeared from the kitchen, his tie loosened and his shirt wrinkled, looking like a man who'd been forced to deal with unexpected crises. "Mom, we were worried sick. You can't just disappear without telling anyone where you're going." Worried sick. The phrase might have touched my heart if I hadn't seen the grocery bags on the kitchen counter. Evidence that they'd been forced to pick up dinner on their way home instead of arriving to a house that smelled of home-cooked meals. "I'm sorry you were worried," I said, and I meant it. "But I'm a grown woman, Eric. I don't need permission to leave the house during the day." "But you have responsibilities here," Sarah protested. "People depending on you. You can't just abandon your duties because you feel like going for a walk." Duties. Responsibilities. The words that had defined my existence for 2 years, transformed from willing service into obligatory servitude somewhere along the way. "Sarah," I said, looking directly into her eyes, "I've been thinking about something you said yesterday, about how I live here out of charity, about how there's no my money anymore." Her face flushed slightly, perhaps remembering the harsh tone she'd used during our kitchen confrontation. "And I realized you were right," I continued. "As long as I accept charity, as long as I allow other people to control my finances and my choices, then I really don't have any money of my own. I really am just a dependent who should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity I'm allowed to keep." Eric stepped forward, his expression shifting from anger to concern. "Mom, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've decided to make some changes in my financial situation," I replied, reaching into my purse to pull out the envelope that still contained my rent money. "Starting with this." I held up the envelope, watching their faces as they realized what I was holding. "This is the rent money I was going to give you today," I said, "but I've decided to keep it instead. I've decided to start building my own independence again, $1 at a time." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Eric's face went through a complicated series of emotions: surprise, disappointment, and something that looked almost like fear. "Mom," he said carefully, "you can't just stop paying rent. This is a business arrangement. We have obligations, expenses, a mortgage to pay." "Then I suppose," I said, my voice steady and calm despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs, "we need to discuss what kind of business arrangement this really is, and whether it's working for everyone involved." For the first time in 2 years, I had their complete attention. For the first time since I'd moved into their house, I was setting the terms of a conversation instead of simply responding to their demands. And as I stood there in their living room, holding my own money in my own hands, I felt the Holy Spirit moving through me like a gentle wind, reminding me that I was a daughter of the king, worthy of respect and dignity, regardless of my age or circumstances. The conversation that followed would change everything, but for this moment, this single, perfect moment, I was just Helen Whitmore again, a woman with choices, with power, with hope for a future that belonged entirely to her. 3 days after my declaration of financial independence, Eric called a family meeting. The words themselves sent a chill through my spine, because in our household, family meetings were reserved for serious crises, like when Jake had been caught cheating on a math test or when Sarah's credit card bills had gotten out of control the previous Christmas. "We need to sit down and talk about this situation," Eric announced over dinner on Sunday evening, his voice carrying the weight of a corporate executive addressing underperforming employees. "All of us. Tonight. After the kids go to bed." Emma looked between her parents and me with the worried expression of a child who sensed adult tension without understanding its source. Jake continued eating his spaghetti with the oblivious focus of a 7-year-old, but I caught him glancing at me with curious eyes that suggested he'd overheard more adult conversations than anyone realized. That evening, as I tucked Emma into bed, a privilege I'd been granted because Sarah had a headache, my granddaughter grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Grandma Helen, are you in trouble again?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her humidifier. "Sometimes, sweetheart, adults have to have difficult conversations about how to live together peacefully," I replied, smoothing her brown hair away from her face. "But no matter what happens, remember that your grandma loves you very much. Are you going to have to go away?" The question pierced my heart because it came from such innocent wisdom. This 10-year-old child could sense what the adults were planning before it had been explicitly stated. "I don't know yet, Emma, but if I do, it will be because sometimes people need different things to be happy, and that's okay. It doesn't mean anyone is bad or wrong." She nodded solemnly, then surprised me by sitting up and wrapping her thin arms around my neck. "I'll pray for you, Grandma. I'll ask Jesus to help you." I held her tight, breathing in the sweet scent of her shampoo and feeling the fierce love that grandmothers know, the kind that would move mountains if mountains needed moving. "Thank you, baby girl. That means more to me than you could ever know." Downstairs, Eric and Sarah had arranged themselves in the living room like prosecutors preparing to present their case. Eric sat in his leather recliner, the one I wasn't supposed to use because it was positioned for optimal television viewing, while Sarah perched on the edge of the couch with a legal pad in her lap, as if she'd been taking notes on my transgressions. I chose the wooden chair from the dining room set, carrying it into the living room and placing it directly across from them. If this was going to be a trial, I wanted to face my accusers with dignity. "Mom," Eric began, his tone suggesting he'd rehearsed this speech, "we need to address what happened this week. Your behavior has been concerning." "Concerning how?" I asked, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded. Sarah consulted her legal pad as if reading from prepared talking points. "You abandoned your household responsibilities without notice. You disappeared for an entire day without telling anyone where you were going. You refused to pay rent that you've been paying consistently for 2 years. And you're apparently gambling again despite our clear conversation about why that's inappropriate." Gambling again. As if my $5 lottery ticket purchases constituted a dangerous addiction rather than a lonely woman's modest investment in hope. "Those are accurate facts," I agreed, "but I'm curious about your interpretation of what they mean." Eric leaned forward in his chair, adopting the patient expression he used when explaining complex financial concepts to clients he considered intellectually inferior. "They mean that you're not adapting well to the structure we've created here. They mean that you're acting out instead of communicating like an adult." Acting out. The phrase they might use to describe Emma's behavior when she was frustrated about bedtime or Jake's tantrums when he didn't want to eat his vegetables. I was being characterized as a child having an emotional breakdown rather than an adult making conscious choices about her own life. "And what do you think the solution is?" I asked. Sarah and Eric exchanged a look that confirmed they'd already discussed this extensively, probably over several private conversations that had excluded me entirely. "We think," Sarah said carefully, "that you might be happier in a more structured environment, somewhere with people your own age, with activities designed for seniors, with professional staff who understand the needs of elderly residents." elderly residents, professional staff. She was describing a nursing home without using the words, packaging it in language designed to make institutionalization sound like a luxury vacation. "You want to put me in a home," I said simply. "We want to explore options that might be better for everyone," Eric corrected. But his voice lacked conviction. "Places where you'd have more independence, more social interaction, more appropriate activities for someone at your stage of life." My stage of life. As if being 69 automatically disqualified me from living like a regular human being. As if aging had moved me into some separate category of existence that required special handling by trained professionals. I sat quietly for a moment, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. They wanted me to argue, to plead, to promise to be better if they'd just give me another chance. They wanted me to demonstrate the desperate gratitude of someone who understood how lucky she was to be tolerated by her own family. Instead, I opened my purse and pulled out my Bible, the same leather-bound book Robert had given me 40 years ago, its pages soft with age and use, its margins filled with my handwritten prayers and underlined verses that had sustained me through every crisis. "Before we continue this conversation," I said, "I'd like to read something." Sarah rolled her eyes with the exaggerated patience of someone humoring a difficult relative, but Eric nodded curtly. I opened to Ephesians 6:10-11, passages I'd memorized during the darkest days after Robert's death, and read aloud, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." "Mom, what does that have to do with—" Eric started to interrupt. "I'm not finished," I said firmly, and something in my tone made him stop speaking. "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." I closed the Bible and looked directly at both of them, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since I'd moved into their house. "You know what I've realized?" I said. "I've been fighting the wrong battle. I've been trying to earn your love and respect through service and sacrifice. But you've already decided that I'm not worth loving or respecting. You've decided that I'm a burden, an inconvenience, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cherished." "That's not true," Sarah protested, but her voice lacked sincerity. "Isn't it?" I pulled out the envelope containing my rent money, setting it on the coffee table between us. "This represents $600 of my monthly Social Security check. For 2 years, I've given you this money plus bought groceries, plus worked as your unpaid housekeeper and babysitter. Do you know what the average cost of assisted living is in Chicago?" They both stared at me without answering. $3,000 a month, I continued. Minimum, for a shared room and basic care. "I've been paying you less than 20% of what professional care would cost, while providing more services than most paid caregivers. And you want to convince me that I'm the one being unreasonable?" Eric's face flushed red. "Mom, you're twisting the situation. We've provided you with housing, food, family companionship. You've provided me with a room barely larger than a closet, leftover food, and the kind of companionship you'd show a stray cat you felt obligated to feed," I interrupted. "And in return, I've given you my life savings, my independence, and 2 years of unpaid labor. We never asked you to—" Sarah began. "To what? To sell my house and give you the money? To pay rent while also doing all your housework? To babysit your children while you enjoyed date nights? You never asked, but you certainly expected. And when I tried to keep $5 for myself, you called me a thief and a gambling addict." I stood up from my chair, feeling taller than I had in months. "I forgive you," I said simply. "Both of you. I forgive you for taking advantage of my love and my loneliness. I forgive you for treating me like hired help instead of family. I forgive you for making me feel ashamed of my age and my needs and my dreams." Eric's mouth opened in surprise. This wasn't the conversation he'd planned to have. "But," I continued, "I won't enable you anymore. I won't pretend that this arrangement is working for anyone except you. I won't continue to subsidize your lifestyle while you convince yourselves that you're doing me a favor." "What are you saying?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising to the pitch it reached when she felt her control slipping away. "I'm saying that I'm moving out," I replied. "I'm saying that I'm going to find my own place to live, where I can read my Bible without hiding it, where I can go to church without asking permission, where I can spend my own money without being called a thief. With what money? Eric stood up, his face darkening with anger. You don't have enough to live independently. You're being completely unrealistic. I smiled, feeling the peace that comes from knowing you're doing God's will, even when it terrifies you. I have more resources than you think, I said quietly, and more faith than you've given me credit for. This is ridiculous, Sarah snapped. Helen, you're almost 70 years old. You can't just start over. You need us. No, I said, my voice growing stronger. You need me. You need someone to watch your children and clean your house and subsidize your expenses. But I don't need to be treated like a burden by people who should love me unconditionally. Eric slammed his hand down on the armrest of his chair. Fine. If that's how you want it, fine. But don't come crawling back when you realize how hard it is to live on a fixed income. Don't expect us to bail you out when your little rebellion fails. I won't, I promised. But I'll pray for you, both of you. I'll pray that someday you understand what you've lost, and that it's not too late to become the people God intended you to be. I walked to my bedroom and closed the door behind me, my hands shaking not with fear, but with the adrenaline of liberation. I knelt beside my bed and pulled out my winning lottery tickets, $535 in cash that represented more than money. They represented God's provision, his reminder that he still had plans for Helen Whitmore. Lord, I whispered, I don't know what comes next. I don't know where I'll live or how I'll manage or whether I'm making the right choice. But I trust you. I trust that you haven't brought me this far to abandon me now. Outside my door, I could hear Eric and Sarah's voices raised in angry discussion about my ingratitude and poor judgment. But their words couldn't touch me anymore. I was wearing the armor of God, protected by the knowledge that I was his beloved daughter, worthy of respect and dignity regardless of my age or circumstances. Tomorrow, I would start looking for my own place. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of rebuilding Helen Whitmore's independent life. Tonight, I would sleep peacefully for the first time in 2 years, knowing that I had finally chosen myself over the false peace of being tolerated. And if God could part the Red Sea for Moses, if he could feed 5,000 with a few loaves and fishes, if he could raise Jesus from the dead, then surely he could help one determined old woman find her way home to herself. The next morning, I woke before dawn not from habit, but from excitement. For the first time in 2 years, I had somewhere important to be that belonged entirely to me. I was going apartment hunting, not as someone's unwanted burden, but as Helen Whitmore, a woman with her own money, her own dreams, and her own relationship with the Almighty. I dressed in my navy blue dress again, the one that had felt so special just days earlier, and spent extra time with my appearance. When I looked in the mirror, I saw something I hadn't seen in years, a woman with purpose. My gray hair looked distinguished rather than old. My lines spoke of wisdom rather than wear. My eyes held hope instead of resignation. The house was still asleep as I slipped out the front door with my purse and my newfound determination. I didn't leave a note. After years of accounting for every movement, every breath, every dollar, I was learning the radical freedom of not needing anyone's permission to exist. My first stop was St. Mary's Catholic Church, where Father Martinez was preparing for early morning mass. The familiar smell of incense and the soft glow of votive candles welcomed me like a warm embrace from an old friend who'd been waiting patiently for my return. Helen, Father Martinez looked genuinely delighted to see me. I was just thinking about you yesterday. Margaret mentioned that she'd sent you a birthday card but hadn't heard back. Margaret's birthday card, the one Sarah and Eric had opened and discarded like junk mail. My heart clenched with the memory, but this time the pain felt clean instead of poisonous. Father, I need to ask you about something, I said, settling into a front pew where morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting rainbows across the worn wooden surfaces. Do you know of any apartments for rent nearby? Something modest, but mine? His weathered face broke into a smile that spoke of understanding beyond words. Actually, I do, Mrs. Rodriguez, one of our longtime parishioners, has a small apartment above her garage. She's been looking for the right tenant, someone quiet, respectful, who might appreciate being part of a church community. A church community. The words fell on my ears like music, like the promise of belonging somewhere without having to earn it through endless service and self-sacrifice. The rent is $400 a month, utilities included, Father Martinez continued. Mrs. Rodriguez lost her husband last year, and I think she'd welcome having someone nearby who shares her faith. $400. $200 less than I'd been paying Eric and Sarah for the privilege of being treated like unwanted houseguest. Money that would leave me with enough left over from my Social Security to actually live, rather than merely survive. After Mass, my first in weeks, and it felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey, Father Martinez walked me 3 blocks to a small white house with a neat garden and a separate garage topped by a tiny apartment. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez turned out to be a woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes who greeted me like family before she'd even learned my name. "You have a peaceful spirit," she said after we'd talked for 10 minutes in her kitchen over coffee and homemade churros. "That's more important than references or credit scores. Besides, Father Martinez wouldn't have brought me anyone who wasn't good people." The apartment was perfect in its simplicity. 1 bedroom with a window that looked out onto Elena's flower garden. A small kitchen with everything I needed and nothing I didn't. A living area just large enough for a comfortable chair, a small table, and the cross I'd been longing to hang without asking permission. "I can move in this weekend," I told Elena, my voice steady with certainty I hadn't felt in years. "Wonderful. And Helen, you must call me Elena. None of this Mrs. Rodriguez nonsense. I hope you'll join me for coffee sometimes. I make fresh churros on Sundays after church, and it's been lonely eating them by myself. Coffee with a friend. Churros on Sunday mornings. The simple pleasures of human companionship offered freely rather than rationed like rewards for good behavior. I nearly cried right there in her sunny kitchen. That afternoon, I used some of my lottery winnings to buy basic furnishings from a thrift store run by the Methodist Church downtown. A comfortable armchair in soft blue fabric. A small kitchen table with 2 chairs. A bedside lamp that cast warm, gentle light. Dishes and glasses and silverware that belonged to me, chosen by me, for my own use. The young volunteers at the thrift store, college students from the local seminary, offered to deliver everything free of charge when they learned I was starting over at 69. "That takes real courage," one of them said, as we loaded my purchases into their van. "My grandmother always says that it's never too late to bloom where God plants you. Bloom where God plants you." The phrase echoed in my heart like a promise as I rode back to Eric's house to collect my belongings. For 2 years, I'd been trying to bloom in soil that had been deliberately poisoned against me. Now God was replanting me in ground that might actually nurture growth. When I arrived back at the house, I found Eric pacing in the living room with his cell phone pressed to his ear, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic he usually reserved for work crises. "I understand that, but she's not thinking clearly," he was saying to whoever was on the other end. "She's almost 70. She's been making poor financial decisions, and frankly, I'm worried about her mental state." Mental state. He was discussing my psychological fitness with someone as if my decision to live independently was evidence of dementia rather than determination. "Eric," I said calmly. "Who are you talking to?" He turned to look at me with the expression of someone caught in an embarrassing act. "Just a friend. Someone who might have advice about senior housing options. A friend. More likely a lawyer or social worker he hoped might help him prove I was incompetent to make my own decisions." The realization should have hurt, but instead it clarified something important. My son was more concerned with controlling me than caring for me. "I won't be needing senior housing," I said pleasantly. "I've found a lovely apartment near St. Mary's. I'll be moving out this weekend." The color drained from Eric's face. "Mom, you can't be serious. You looked at apartments? You signed a lease? Without discussing it with us?" "I'm 69 years old, Eric, not 9. I don't need your permission to sign legal documents." Sarah appeared from the kitchen, her expression shifting rapidly between disbelief and what looked suspiciously like panic. "Helen, this is insane. You can't afford your own place. You'll be back here within a month, begging us to take you in." "I won't," I said with quiet certainty. But thank you for your concern. Over the next 3 days, I methodically packed my belongings, while Eric and Sarah alternatively ignored me, lectured me, and tried to convince me that I was making a terrible mistake. They seemed genuinely baffled by my calm determination, as if they'd expected tears and pleading rather than purposeful action. Emma helped me pack my books, handling each one with the careful reverence of a child who'd learned to love reading, partly through the stories I'd shared with her. "Will you still be my grandma when you live somewhere else?" she asked as we wrapped my Bible in tissue paper. "I'll always be your grandma," I assured her. "And now you'll have a new place to visit, where we can read stories and bake cookies without anyone telling us we're too loud or making too much mess. Can I come see your new apartment?" I glanced toward the kitchen where Sarah was banging pots with unnecessary force, clearly listening to our conversation. "If your parents say it's okay, you're always welcome." On Saturday morning, the seminary students arrived with their van to help me move. Elena had come along, bringing a thermos of coffee and homemade sandwiches for the volunteers. She took one look at Eric and Sarah's cold demeanor and positioned herself firmly at my side like a protective guardian angel. "You have good friends," she murmured to me as we watched the young men carefully carry my few possessions to their van. "I'm learning that," I replied, feeling truth in the words that surprised me with its depth. As I prepared to leave the house where I'd spent 2 of the most difficult years of my life, Eric made one final attempt to control the narrative. "Mom, when this doesn't work out, and it won't, don't expect us to drop everything to rescue you. We have our own family to think about, our own responsibilities." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised with such love and sacrifice, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete emotional detachment from his approval. His good opinion, which had been the driving force of my existence for 44 years, simply didn't matter anymore. "Eric," I said gently, "I hope someday you understand that independence isn't the same as abandonment. I hope you learn the difference between loving someone and controlling them. And I hope that when you're my age, you're surrounded by people who celebrate your strength rather than punish you for your needs." I kissed Emma and Jake goodbye, promising to call them soon. I didn't say goodbye to Eric and Sarah. Some endings don't require ceremonies. My new apartment felt like sanctuary from the moment I crossed the threshold. Elena had left flowers on the kitchen counter and a note that read, "Welcome home, dear friend. The coffee pot is always on next door." That evening, I sat in my new blue armchair with my Bible open in my lap and my rosary beads warm in my hands. Through my window, I could see Elena's garden where evening flowers were opening to catch the last light of day. "Thank you," I whispered to the God who had never abandoned me even when I'd felt most forgotten. "Thank you for reminding me that I'm your daughter first, and that your daughters deserve dignity and respect, and the freedom to bloom where you plant them." As the sun set over my new life, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Excitement for tomorrow. Excitement for the woman I was becoming. For the community I was joining. For the possibilities that opened when you stopped begging for scraps and started believing you deserved the whole feast. Helen Whitmore was finally home. Not in a building, but in her own skin. In her own faith. In her own unshakable knowledge that she was beloved by the King of Kings. And that was worth more than all the lottery jackpots in the world. Almost. The phone rang, interrupting my prayers. Elena's voice came through with barely contained excitement. "Helen, dear, do you have a television? Turn on Channel 7 News. You're not going to believe what I just heard about lottery winners." I didn't have a television yet, but something in Elena's voice made my heart start beating faster. Tomorrow, I decided, I would buy a television. Tonight, I would just trust that whatever news she'd heard was part of God's perfect plan for the woman who'd finally learned to believe she deserved good things. Tomorrow would bring its own miracles. Tonight, I was exactly where I belonged. The next morning, Elena's excited knocking woke me from the deepest, most peaceful sleep I'd experienced in years. I opened my door to find her holding a steaming cup of coffee and a newspaper, her eyes bright with barely contained joy. "Helen, dear, sit down," she said, practically vibrating with excitement. "I have something to show you that's going to change your life." I settled into my blue armchair, my chair in my apartment, where no one could tell me I wasn't allowed to sit. and accepted the coffee with grateful hands. Elena spread the newspaper across my small kitchen table, pointing to a headline that made my heart stop beating for a full 3 seconds. Unclaimed lottery winner has 30 days to collect $1. 7 million jackpot. Beneath the headline was a photograph of a lottery ticket, and even from across the room, I could see numbers that looked impossibly familiar. Numbers I'd been carrying in my Bible for 3 weeks, tucked between the pages of Matthew where Jesus talks about mustard seed faith moving mountains. "Elena?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What does this mean?" "It means, dear friend, that someone bought a winning lottery ticket 3 weeks ago at Martina's corner store. That's the place where I buy my groceries, just 4 blocks from here. And they haven't claimed their prize yet. The ticket is worth $1.7 million. My hands started shaking so violently I had to set down the coffee cup. With trembling fingers, I reached into my Bible and pulled out the small collection of lottery tickets I'd been carrying like prayer cards, each one a tiny investment in hope that I'd been too afraid to check thoroughly. The first ticket I examined was clearly a loser. The second showed 2 matching symbols but nothing more. But the third ticket, the one I'd bought the day before my birthday with change I'd saved from bottle returns, I had to look at it 5 times before I trusted what I was seeing. The numbers matched perfectly. Every single digit corresponded exactly to the winning combination printed in the newspaper. The date was correct, the store location was correct, and the prize amount, $1,700,000, was printed clearly at the bottom in bold official letters. "Elena," I breathed. I think this is mine." She leaned over to look at the ticket, her eyes moving back and forth between the newspaper and the small piece of cardboard that had just transformed from worthless scrap into a document worth more money than I'd ever imagined possessing. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," Elena whispered, crossing herself with automatic reverence. "Helen, you're holding a winning lottery ticket worth $1.7 million. The room began to spin around me, and for a moment I thought I might faint. Elena guided me back to my chair, both of us staring at the ticket as if it might disappear if we looked away. "What do I do?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. What happens next?" Elena, bless her practical soul, had already thought 3 steps ahead. "First, we call the lottery office to verify the ticket. Then we find you a good lawyer and an accountant. Then we praise God for his mysterious ways. Because this is clearly divine intervention. Divine intervention." As the initial shock began to wear off, I felt a deep sense of rightness about what had occurred. This wasn't random luck or cosmic coincidence. This was God's way of proving that he'd been listening to every prayer, witnessing every humiliation, keeping careful account of every sacrifice I'd made and every dignity I'd endured having stripped away. The lottery office confirmed what we already knew. I was indeed the holder of an unclaimed $1.7 million winning ticket. After taxes, I would receive approximately $1.2 million, paid either as annual installments over 20 years or as a reduced lump sum of $850,000. "The lump sum," I told the lottery official without hesitation. "I'm 69 years old. I don't want to spend 20 years waiting for my own money." Elena drove me to the lottery headquarters in downtown Chicago, where I was photographed holding an oversized check and asked to share my story with local news reporters. I kept my comments brief and focused on gratitude rather than the circumstances that had led me to buying lottery tickets in the first place. "I'm just a woman of faith who's been reminded that God has plans for all of us," I told the reporters. "Sometimes those plans are bigger than we can imagine." But the real test came 3 days later, when Eric called. I was sitting in Elena's garden, helping her plant winter flowers and enjoying the simple pleasure of having dirt under my fingernails without anyone criticizing me for being messy, when my phone rang. Eric's name appeared on the caller ID, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt no anxiety about answering. "Hello, Eric," I said calmly. "Mom." His voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, uncertainty mixed with what sounded suspiciously like desperation. We saw the news. About the lottery. Is it true?" "It's true." A long pause followed. during which I could practically hear him calculating, strategizing, preparing his approach for getting access to money he'd never imagined I might possess. Mom, that's incredible. Congratulations. I'm so happy for you. Happy for me. 3 weeks ago, he'd called me delusional for buying lottery tickets with my own money. Now he was celebrating my success as if he'd supported my dreams all along. Thank you, I said simply. Listen, I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I realize I may have been hasty. Maybe we were all under a lot of stress, and we didn't handle things as well as we could have. Hasty. As if years of emotional abuse and financial manipulation could be dismissed as momentary poor judgment. I see, I replied, giving him no emotional handholds to grab onto. The thing is, Mom, I'm worried about you. Suddenly having access to that much money can be overwhelming for anyone, especially someone who's not used to managing large sums. There are scams, predators, people who target lottery winners specifically, someone who's not used to managing large sums. This from the man who'd managed to spend $85,000 of my house sale money in 2 years, while convincing me I was living off his charity. I appreciate your concern, I said. Maybe it would be smart for you to move back home while you figure out how to handle everything. We could help you make good financial decisions, protect you from people who might try to take advantage. There it was. The real reason for his call, delivered with the same patronizing concern he'd used to convince me to sell my house and move in with them in the first place. Eric, I said gently, do you remember what you told me the night I left? You said not to come crawling back when my rebellion failed. You said not to expect you to bail me out. I was angry, Mom. I didn't mean... You meant every word, I interrupted. And you were right. I don't need anyone to bail me out. I don't need anyone to protect me from predators, because I've already learned to recognize them. The silence that followed was profound. You're making a mistake, he said finally, his voice hardening as he realized his approach wasn't working. You're going to lose all that money, and when you do, don't expect us to... Goodbye, Eric, I said, and ended the call. Elena, who'd been pretending to focus on her flowers while obviously listening to every word, looked up with approval shining in her eyes. That, she said, was perfectly handled. 6 months later, I'm writing this story from the sunroom of my new house, a modest 3-bedroom home just 2 blocks from St. Mary's Church, with a garden where I grow vegetables and flowers, and a front porch where I sit with my Bible in the evenings. The house is paid for in full, leaving me with more than enough money invested to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I volunteer at the church's food pantry 3 days a week, coordinate the prayer shawl ministry for new mothers, and sponsor 2 missionary families in Central America. Every month, I anonymously pay the utility bills for 3 families in the parish who are struggling financially, because I remember what it feels like when money is so tight that choosing between heating and eating becomes a real decision. Emma and Jake visit me every other Saturday, not because Eric has had a change of heart, but because Elena's grandson Michael is a family law attorney who helped me establish formal grandparent visitation rights. The children love my new house, where they're allowed to be loud and messy and curious, where we bake cookies on Sunday afternoons and read Bible stories without anyone rolling their eyes. Eric and Sarah have never apologized, but they've never asked for money either. I suspect they're too proud to admit they misjudged me so completely, and too embarrassed to face the woman they'd written off as a burden and a failure. I pray for them every night, because forgiveness isn't conditional on repentance, and love isn't conditional on reciprocation. But I also pray for myself, that I'll never again mistake being tolerated for being loved, and that I'll never again confuse service with servitude. The lottery money changed my circumstances, but it didn't change who I am. I'm still Helen Whitmore, daughter of the King, worthy of respect and dignity, not because of what I have, but because of whose I am. The money just made it easier for everyone else to see what God had been trying to tell me all along. I matter. My dreams matter. My happiness matters. And sometimes, when you've been faithful through the desert years, God shows up with more than enough to make up for all the years the locusts have eaten. Let me ask you something. Have you ever lived through something like this? Or do you know someone who has? How did faith help you or them find strength during the darkest times? If this story touched your heart, please share your experience in the comments below. And if you believe this message might help someone who needs to hear it, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Sometimes God uses our stories to plant seeds of hope in hearts that need them most. May God bless everyone who's walked through the valley of feeling forgotten and unloved. May you find your way to the mountaintop, where you can see clearly that you were never alone, never without value, never outside the reach of divine love. In Jesus' name, amen.